Partly sunny skies and a beautiful 78 degrees over Bowman. Hey, here's Mark O'Connor.
Charles Taylor wasn't always able to walk down Main Street in Bowman, North Dakota. In fact, until 1985, Charles didn't have many of the freedoms Americans take for granted. Charles is a person with mental retardation, and for more than 30 years, he lived at the Grafton Developmental Center, known then as the Grafton State School.
I've known Charles since he first moved to Bowman, about 7 years ago. Charlie wouldn't look up. He walked in, he had no expression on his face whatsoever. In fact, he was scared to death. I'd imagine the change from moving where he was from to here really shocked him, but Charlie didn't say a word to us, and so I introduced myself to him, and he has gotten to know me quite well over the years.
Charles is one of more than 800 former residents of the state school who realized his freedom after the Association for Retarded Citizens of North Dakota filed a lawsuit against the state in 1980. The suit charged that the state was violating the constitutional rights of more than 1,200 residents in Grafton and Grafton's sister facility, San Haven State Hospital.
Try that on.
When I moved to Grafton, and I came into the state school, and the nurse took me by the hand, and she says, "Come here." And I says, "Okay," and she took me by the hand, she stuck me into the room, and she shut the door. She didn't explain what it was, and I got upset, so I knocked at the door, and I asked her what this was about, being locked up for 2 weeks.
Eileen Haugen also lived at the Grafton State School for more than 30 years. She was first admitted as a 9-year-old child.
Well, she says, "Eileen," she says, "I know you're nice and clean," but she says, we had a girl that came to the state school, and she had lice. So this is why we're checking all the people that are coming in now for lice. So I had to be be in this room for 2 weeks before I could go between the people.
In 1982, a federal judge agreed with the ARC that constitutional rights were violated and ordered the state to improve conditions, specifically to decrease the population of the state institutions and to develop programs in communities across the state of North Dakota. Grafton began operation in 1904 as the North Dakota Institution for the Feeble-Minded. It had lofty goals then, reflecting a national emphasis to promote individual development while preparing residents for lives on the outside.
What we found typically in the middle part of the country is that at the latter part of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we started seeing larger facilities being built for people. And over time, what we found was that a much larger number of people moved in to those facilities than moved out. And so the facilities got increasingly larger.
This, along with the Depression of the 1930s, left institutions as custodians of the mentally retarded for 3 decades. In the 1960s, a new model of care swept the nation. Called the Developmental Theory, it was based on the premise that all individuals can learn.
And so from a learning standpoint, the developmental process described how we were trying to deal, in this business, we were trying to deal with understanding how people learn, especially people who were having difficulty learning. How did they learn, and what could we do to help speed that up?
There was a rush across the country to develop programs and living conditions in a least restrictive environment. People with disabilities could choose the services that would give them the greatest degree of personal freedom. These services met their needs, yet still took into account their level of disability. Everywhere, barriers of institutionalization were crumbling. Everywhere, that is, but North Dakota.
There was very little service being provided them at the institution, and parents who were in the communities had very little choice but to place children in the institution. And those individuals who had been placed at Grafton just remained there for years and years and years. It became their home until they died.
Back in 1980, there were a variety of circumstances that led to the filing of the lawsuit. One of the primary factors that was considered is that across the nation there was a pretty concerted movement toward deinstitutionalization. Institutions like the Developmental Center were downsizing. Other states just didn't feel it was appropriate to put more and more people into institutions.
In fact, North Dakota was doing just the opposite. 163 people with mental retardation per 100,000 population were institutionalized across the state. The national average was 58 per 100,000. The average cost for maintaining services for a person with mental retardation was over $68 nationwide. Only $26.42, barely one-third, was spent here in North Dakota.
And overcrowding combined with low funding produces a pretty predictable result. The conditions up at Grafton then were pretty deplorable.
It wasn't as if state officials had not been warned either. Numerous reports, some even commissioned by the legislature itself, denounced the deplorable conditions. In 1960, the National Institute of Mental Health declared,
adequate services for the mentally retarded include facilities for diagnosis and classification, special education, vocational training, sheltered workshops, parent counseling, and physical restoration, as well as institutional care. North Dakota is sadly lacking in all of these areas.
In 1968, a report to the governor, legislature, and the citizens of North Dakota urged the state to
develop more community facilities for the mentally retarded, as well as methods to recruit and retain adequate staff to promote those necessary services.
Perhaps the most damning report of all was made in 1979. Dr. Stephen Taylor, an assistant professor of special education and rehabilitation at Syracuse University, found conditions at the San Haven Hospital wretched.
San Haven is called a state hospital. It is better described as a human warehouse. As the head administrator said, residents leave one way, through death.
And the ARC was very reluctant to file a lawsuit. And eventually they came to the decision that when there was no other choice, that was what had to be done.
The United States District Court, District of North Dakota, Southwestern Division, is now in session.
It will present evidence to demonstrate that the state of North Dakota has not met the statutory and constitutional right of class members. A, the right to habilitation mandated by the Due Process Clause is not being provided. B, the right to protection from harm is not being provided. And C, the right to a least restrictive environment is not being provided.
I had been in Grafton once or twice, I don't remember why, but I didn't see it the way I saw it this time. The entire building was tile, and I guess there was some wall covering, but it was very cold, very, very cold.
We visited both Grafton and San Haven for probably up to a year at different times, and every time we walked through, you couldn't help but be struck by the sensation that this is not a home, that this is more or less a human warehouse.
An impressive list of witnesses lined up to testify against the state.
The environment is an integral part of the treatment experience. It's probably the most important part. Grafton and San Haven environments affected all observers of the institution negatively.
Noise levels were disturbing and impeded communication. Wards smelled of urine and feces.
Judge Van Sickle had his own understanding of the terrible neglect at the institution.
I was there at a mealtime, and of course, to connect the buildings, they had tunnels. And I was particularly struck when I saw a cargo cart. And as I recall it, there were 2 or 3 people loaded onto that cargo cart in various conditions of lying or sitting. They had very little movement that they were able to perform. And they were wheeled down through this tunnel, and there were others coming in chairs that really didn't fit them. And if that wasn't bad enough, there were some tunnels turning off. There was the lighted tunnel they were using, and there were a couple of dark type tunnels. And the kitchen or the dining room appeared to be overcrowded, and some of these people were simply shunted off into a dark end of a tunnel and left there, or a dark intersection, until they could clear out the dining room, and then they'd wheel them in and feed them. Also, they were feeding the patients in a half upright position, and they were fed from above. And I thought of nothing so much as the pictures of a baby bird being fed by the mother bird. Well, of course, that's the most unnatural position you can imagine. Try it yourself. Just tip your head up and see how it feels to try to swallow. That impressed me adversely.
In order to escape the ward and be alone, one resident would sit clothed on the corner toilet and pull her knees up to her head.
Even where some privacy provisions had been attempted in bathrooms, shower curtains had been tied up over the rails, so that didn't provide privacy.
There's a great lack of sensitivity on the part of the staff concerning nakedness.
And another thing I didn't like about this Grafton State School, when we took baths, they wouldn't change the water. They'd make you wash maybe 2 people in one water. And I didn't go for that. Because when I knew that's going to happen, I'd always try to be the first one to be in the clean water.
There were windows into which I could look at this room, and there were people crouched in a corner. There were people pounding their heads against the wall this way and pounding their heads against the wall this way. There were people curled up in a corner. There were people lying down. There was no particular activity, no flow of activity.
There were virtually no programs of any type in operation. And for many of the residents, they simply lay in bed, lay on the floor, sat in a chair for the entire time that we were there.
One of the most striking things to me was when you walk through the children's unit. And especially with kids, you hate to see any kind of suffering. And the most telling thing when you walked through the children's unit was the kids never smiled.
The fire escape consisted of a tube, a slide, covered slide. But the problem was this one little woman she was no giant by any means, and harried and tired and rushing and trying to be nice, is supposed to take these men out of the beds and start them down that chute, and they'll go down that chute in the middle of the winter, and they'll land outside in 20 below weather and pile up like so many sticks at the bottom of the chute, because if you've got a fire pushing you from the back and no help in the front, that's just about the few that you get down will just lie there in the snow and freeze to death.
Included in the right to a safe and humane environment is the premise that adequate numbers of staff are required, but
there were insufficient numbers of RNs, licensed physicians or nurse practitioners, pharmacists. I think that psychotropic medications are used for the convenience of staff. They're used as a substitute for programs and used on occasion as punishment. Restraints at both Grafton and San Haven were used as a substitute for programs, as a convenience for the staff and as punishment. The residents must feel terribly dehumanized.
the state of North Dakota had failed its people. It was obvious there was no state agency that had sufficient power or funds to commit to community development.
The state has money tied up for generations in institutional programs, political commitments to jobs and other things, and that's the reason that they have not been, quote, able to develop adequate community programs.
The bureaucratic buck passing has caused disastrous results for the mentally retarded. The lack of community services and placements may be attributable to the lack of a proper administrative entity for developmental disabilities and a perverse commitment to institutions.
On August 31st, 1982, Judge Bruce Van Sickle ordered the state to reduce the population of the Grafton State School to 450 by 1987 and to 200 by 1989. The state was also directed to develop a comprehensive list of services for the diagnosis, evaluation, habilitation, and rehabilitation of people with mental retardation.
What rights are, in essence, is simply those inalienable rights, things that people have a right to do. And it does not matter whether you're handicapped or not, those things don't change. Everybody has a right to a freedom of choice in where they live, a freedom of choice in where they work, the right to be educated and to learn.
Hello, Charles. You getting yourself a tape today?
Yeah.
Yeah. I need $11.54, please.
Simply putting a person in a geographic area, for instance, moving from a large facility to a group home or an apartment or whatever, while that is a step in the right direction, that in and of itself is not enough. What we really need to be able to do is to create an environment, a community, if you will, and support that community as they learn how to welcome this individual back to their midst.
Well, you come in every day and look for that, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay, see ya. Thanks a lot.
Initially, I think most people felt that the development of community programs would take place in the larger cities of the state. As it turned out, the state also was interested in seeing how services could be provided in some of the smaller communities. So we have areas like Fessenden and Harvey and Stanley and some of the other smaller communities also providing service programs for people with developmental disabilities.
Most North Dakotans don't realize the positive economic impact deinstitutionalization has had on the state. Now that programs meet federal standards, more than 70 cents of every dollar spent on the developmentally disabled is federally funded. In 9 years since 1983, over $241 million have been spent on housing and programs for the developmentally disabled throughout the state. Nearly $191 million of that has come from the federal government. Those dollars are new to North Dakota.
People who were taken out of Grafton, placed in their own apartments or placed in other types of group home settings, who are now holding their own jobs, have gained a tremendous amount in terms of pride and respect for themselves.
I think the recycling program is a perfect example of how an operation such as ours, serving people with disabilities, can co-mingle or co-op with a community such as Harvey. They feel it is important enough to get a program like this going in order to save them some landfill costs, and it also helps our industry because we're trying to find some employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Beverly moved here in 1983 into one of our group homes. Since then, she's moved into her own apartment. She rents that. She still comes to the sheltered workshop for some employment training. However, we've progressed to a point where she's now training on-site in the community. And one of the employment activities she seems to be interested in is a housekeeping type of employment. So we've worked with our local nursing home, and she goes out with a co-worker who also has developmental disabilities. They make beds at the nursing home.
I think the area of employment is one of the key service areas that will need strengthening and a great deal of growth in the future. It's a way that people with developmental disabilities can establish their identities. It's a way they have of contributing something back to society and in earning their own way in life, which is something we all want to do. I think we'll have to be creative and innovative in our approaches to employment for people with disabilities.
I work at the Holiday Inn. I've been there for 5 years. Chuck picks me up at 7:30 in the morning on Friday mornings. And then he picks somebody else up before he drops me off.
Good morning, Eileen. Are you ready to go to work?
Yeah. I wash dishes. And I straighten up things what's messed up. Because one of the cooks told me to me one day here, he says, I think you better come back here when some of the other dishwashers come in and tell them how to put their things. And I said, that doesn't do me no good. I said, it'll be just about the same way when I get back.
As employees, these people are more reliable, that they're very productive, and they're good employees, they're good neighbors, they're good friends, and for them, that just means a complete turnaround from what their lives were before.
Are you going to work?
People who are living in their own apartments, their own homes, are being supported in the ISLA, or Individualized Supported Living Arrangement Program, or through the Supported Living Arrangement Program, and that number now exceeds the number in group homes. I think that's real positive evidence of a move towards a less restrictive environment for individuals.
NSP 1676.
Okay. What kind of a bill is NSP?
Mary Belts never lived in Grafton, yet her life, too, has been touched by the lawsuit filed over a decade ago.
Being Mary was not in Grafton, and she just came right from her home and lived in different group homes. She still benefits from the ARC lawsuit in the fact that if she wouldn't have, she would have really fallen through the cracks, and she wouldn't have had the opportunity to be a part of the programming that North Dakota has offered. And basically she's benefited from that, whereas before she would have just been, you know, on her own, and I don't know if she would have been picked up.
I like living here in my apartment. I'm learning how to do the laundry without any props. I've been doing pretty good this time. Go down a couple floors down and you do it. Then you go back up again and put it away. Boy, that's neat. Instead of having somebody go behind me and say, Mary, do this, Mary, do that. I like being independent, not helpless.
Good time radio, KBOK, forever and ever, amen. That's a great sound. Randy Travis.
Hey, my old buddy Charles is here today. How you doing, Charles, my man? How's it going?
Our field, I think, has changed radically, and a great deal of it comes from our literally just starting to understand that individuals who happen to have a handicap are very complex people and have a great deal more capacity than I think we ever gave them credit for.
Let's see what you got here. Whoa, we got Garth Brooks today. Can I open this?
Go ahead.
You sure?
It's one thing to live in a community as opposed to an institution, but it's quite another thing to be able to participate in that community to the fullest extent possible, and to take advantage of community services and to, in turn, offer something back to the community.
Much has been accomplished since Judge Van Sickle's 1982 court order. Sandhaven is closed, and less than 200 people now live at the Grafton Developmental Center. But we've a long way to go. Simply moving people from a large facility like Grafton to small group homes and apartments is not enough. We have to fight prejudices in ourselves and in others. Prejudices that cause people to be excluded from jobs and schools and neighborhoods.
I think that because in our society we have been rather exclusive. We've been a segregated society, and we have had a tendency to take people who didn't seem to fit in or who seemed unusual in some way. We thought that the way to handle that particular situation was to move them away from the rest of society, which is how you get institutions. Inclusion is the recognition that people have the right to be able to be woven into the fabric of their community. We're really talking about people who are an active part in the community. They're a vibrant piece of that.
All anyone really wants in life is a chance. It is no less for those with developmental disabilities. So it's up to us to accept their disabilities, to tell them they are not alone, to empower them to make decisions on their own, to open our hearts and welcome them as family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, to give them a chance.
People with mental retardation learn from watching other people, and now they have normal, so-called normal role models to learn from. But we've also found that people without disabilities can learn a lot from people with disabilities. They can learn a lot about dignity. They can learn a lot about integrity. They can learn a lot about honesty. They can learn a lot about the basic human needs that we all have. The need to be productive, the need to be loved, all of the basic needs that we share as human beings. In the past, it's always been assumed that people with disabilities don't have those same needs and desires, but they do, and that's what I think we're learning in human terms across the state, is that we're all a lot more alike than we are different.
While their quality of life has improved, much remains to be done for people with mental retardation. Better services and programs, as well as greater public understanding, are needed if people with disabilities are to lead independent, productive lives. To find out more about mental retardation or to learn how you can help, call this number